I'm Dr. Peters. I'm Jonathan Peters. I'm the Deputy EO. This semester, I'm happy to help you in any way I can. Please feel free to reach out to me. I proposed this to Professor Giannakos to do this with you all, to talk about data that might be available, because when I was starting out, you're kind of cooking, you're trying to figure out what you're doing, you're trying to figure out what kind of projects you can work on. When I first got my PhD, I thought, oh, there's no work, there's nothing for me to do. And now I've been doing this for 30 years, and all I think about now is what's not done. Like, there's so many problems that I can tell you that we haven't addressed in society. And so therefore, there's a lot of work for us. Like, we just have work to do. And I would argue that all of us are like the potentially like the physicians for the world economy. You know what I mean? Like, if we get in there and help, we can do things that will help make the economy better, make it fairer, make it function more effectively, deal with things like pollution, deal with things like environmental change, you know. So I do a lot of work on social justice. So it's kind of driven me into the world of a lot of data. And obviously, this is kind of a crazy world for me to be in, because back when I started, data was a very rare commodity, you know, a very, very rare commodity. And nowadays, data is all over the place, you know, and really part of it is to figure out what's out there. So I put together the data series to introduce you to a few sets of data that are out there that might really be productive for you. And I think could really provide you with an opportunity to follow some research lines that might be interesting. Because Weiberberg is teaching spatial econometrics, which we didn't have back in the day because there wasn't a lot of spatial data. I'm going to show a bunch of spatial data today. And I'm happy to talk about techniques. So feel free to ask any questions or stop me at any time. I'm happy to go into the details. I'll also provide you with links if anybody wants to get to these data sources. They're publicly available data sources. The first one I'm going to talk about is one I haven't used extensively. Well, Sam was here, and he actually has used it, so we should probably drag him back and make him talk about it. So I don't know what kind of work, what kind of problems you're thinking about working. I specialize in, again, social justice issues. I've done a lot of work on transportation pricing. I specialize in toll roads, particularly. And I specialize in how we charge for travel and transportation. I work with the American Trucking Association on a regular basis on the regulation and pricing of truck activities. I've done a bunch of work with the National Academy of Sciences on issues related to equity and transportation policy. I'm working a bunch right now on gentrification, how it impacts, like what we do is we build a big transportation system. We'll build a brand new light rail or a brand new transit system. And then of course, what happens, anybody? Well, next thing you know, the prices of housing have gone up and the poor people are priced out of the neighborhood and they get to live out in Eastern Queens beyond the 7 train and they have no housing options. So we're trying to study how to do a better job at that. Okay, so the first series I'm going to look at is what's called, it's a newer data set called the Longitudinal Employment and Household Dynamics data produced by the US Census Bureau. And are you listening now? So I'm going to just go over just quickly over today, since the first day, I'm going to go over what we're going to do in the series. First thing I'm going to talk about are various data sources that are available. I'll provide you with a basic overview, just what you can do with them. I'll give you some links to the documentation. So I'm organizing the documentation for you. I'm going to have next week, we're going to have Jeffrey Paulin in from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He's going to come in via Teams to talk to us about their data set on household consumption. Anybody doing anything about household consumption, I strongly recommend looking at the BLS. We'll talk about data collection and sampling issues. I don't know, Wim, did you start off doing a lot of like survey stuff or collecting data and stuff like that? I'm terrible, man. Nowadays, I don't want to collect data. I just don't want to do it. It's too much work, man. It's too much work. I got to go out in the field. I get cold. I don't know. There's so much data floating around. I really kind of specialize in taking and analyzing data that's there. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about potential uses. And then I really nowadays specialize in what we call natural experiments. You guys are used to natural experiments, which is the data is structured such that if you cut it in certain ways, you can analyze certain problems that are in the data that haven't been analyzed before. So anything that involves a natural experiment is kind of cool. So in the spring, today we're going to do LEHD data and census ZCTA data. Next week, we're going to talk BLS. 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about Brown University. They have a long-term census data series. If you want to study household changes over time, that's a real interesting data set. And the last one's the Pluto data. That is all the housing data for New York City. So the housing data in New York City is available for analytical purposes, and it has a lot of variables that might be useful for you if you're studying like changes in the city over time. Okay, so the LED data, it's a newer data source from the Census Bureau. Of course, the Census Bureau is famous for the US Census, which exists. Why, anybody? Because it's mandated in the Constitution. They've been taking it since 1790, and so it has this long history. LED is a new data set, but the Census Bureau, one of the huge advantages of using one of these sources that I'm going to highlight is obviously you don't have to worry about the sampling. And that's a big deal, because to get your sample right, if you don't get the sampling right, you don't get the right frame, right, Wim? I mean, this is a big deal. You know, do you have any sort of censoring or bias in your sampling procedure? Do you get response rates? Can you afford these response rates? I'm going to show you some examples of a survey that I used that had 65,000 respondents. I don't know about you, but I don't have enough money. They mailed 300,000 surveys. I don't have the cash to mail 300,000 surveys, but they had mailed 300,000 surveys. So the census is going to take care of that data collection piece. Now, the other cool thing about the census data, and they're going to provide documentation. I don't know if you're working with other data sources. Are you working with other data sources yet? I had the opportunity to work, and I'm still working with an app provider. As a matter of fact, it's one of the more famous apps that's out there. It's for navigation purposes. It's called Transit. The app is Transit. Anybody used it? So Transit has an app. Let's see, it's loading now. But it will locate. You have it? Yeah. Okay. Transit will do this. What it'll do is locate you and tell you what transit options are available. I've actually gotten the back end data off of their system, right? You know, they're an app company and they got a lot of high tech people, but data collection is not like their thing. They don't provide much in the way of documentation. They don't provide you much in the way of any sort of guide to how to use the data. Census is different. The Census Bureau has a whole process by which they have documentation as well as information on the sampling procedures that you can use to help you guide how to use the data effectively. And so, you know, Transit, the actual thing will then look at, you know, where you are and then provide you with, like, you know, what type of trains are available and what kind of services. And this thing, what I just did was create a record. And in the case of Transit, the record was created in Montreal. That's where their headquarters is. But their documentation was very, when we got the data, it's very slim. Okay. Now, LEHD is rather different. Now, LEHD is kind of interesting. There's 4 or 5 different data sets inside this series, and it gives you a bunch of information about workforce. I have the source points on the how they're getting the data, and they're a little bit gray about the materials. I had heard originally about this data set when I was down at the conference for transportation researchers. We have the Transportation Lollapalooza every year in Washington, D.C. called the Transportation Research Board. 15,000. Like, have anybody been to ASSA yet? The big economics meetings yet? You haven't been to the economics? I used to think economics. I think they have 8,000, right? At economics, something like that. That's going to be in San Antonio next year, right? They have 15,000 transportation people from all over the world that show up at Lollapalooza. And you know, it's transportation, every type of transportation, airline, shipping, you know, all of them. So one of the census people showed up to talk about loads, which is the second data set. In the documentation, they're not being as clear. What they described it to me when I first heard about it was we typically would get information about workforce and employment from things like the census, right? And the census is taken every 10 years, right? And they used to have the long and the short form. Do you know that? There was a long form that only 1 in 6 households got, and they had the short form that every household got, right? The census in the day was the largest printing job in the world because there's 125 million households in the United States. When they would print the census, the short form, there was 125 million forms sent out. And it's a crappy survey, by the way. Does everybody know that? Because it's done by like temp hired workers. And the census is real kind of sketchy in terms of, like, they don't have permanent staff. They staff up and they staff down every 10 years. And who gets hired is anybody who's around who will work for the, and sometimes the economy's good and they can't get good workers. The other thing is the census is primarily a it's primarily a mail instrument where it's sent out in the mail and they rely on household addresses. And one of the challenges is, especially in urban zones, they have a tendency to have problems getting a good address, especially if like have multifamily households sharing an apartment illegally and stuff. They have a hard time getting good data. The LEHD data is different. The LEHD data they're collecting primarily from worker compensation. That's how they described it. Now, I didn't see it described that much in the current data. They just say state information. Every state in the union has a workman's compensation program where if you get injured on the job, they have a program to pay for your medical benefits, right? The file in the data has where you work, what industry you work in, and where you live. Census Bureau realized this. They realized that they could bring it all together. They have a full listing of where people work, what kind of jobs they have, and where they live, right? So this data set now has actually five different components to it. And what they're doing is they're aggregating this data up. So the first one is if you're doing something related to workforce indicators, right? Well, what's happening in the workforce? That first data set, the QWI data set, might provide you with insight into how people change jobs. And they have things like hires and separations, because when you leave your job, then they take you out of the file. The other thing that's cool is it's getting updated quarterly. We used to have to wait like 5 and 10 years. Like when I was studying household travel, like where you go to work, the big thing in the world of transportation is called journey to work, which is where do you live? And I can show you the question. The question of the census is a funny question, okay? It's not ha-ha funny, but it's a difficult question. They'll ask you the question, where do you go to work? Well, first of all, going to work is not not always, all your travel is not going to work, right? But the second piece of the puzzle is they ask you the following question. How do you travel to work? Now in America, most everybody travels to work by anybody? Auto, what percentage about? Anybody have a guess for me?
80.
Yeah, and what number of people in the car? The US average is 1.25 people per car. And again, it won't drive, although maybe in the future it will drive because we'll have self-driving. But we used to get this every 10 years, and the question only allowed one mode of travel. So if you took a train to a ferry, they ask you to report on the longest part of the trip. I believe it asked for the longest time. But of course, John Q. Public, I don't know if they know, so this was what we had every 10 years. I get an update on data. This thing I'm getting quarterly. So now you can study patterns of change in behavior happening more frequently. It's got the job to job flows, where people are moving from, like where you were working last year and now where you're going to work next year. Did you move from New York to California? I think you can track in this data set. The new one, they've got two of them. One is they're studying how veterans employment is changing. So if you're a veteran of the military services in the US, they're looking at that. And they have a new one. I haven't even poked into this. This is going to be one interesting to look at. They're looking at the job outcome employment from post-secondary education. I hope you know you guys are in the right program, right? At the GC, correct? Because like our job outcomes are what? Anybody? Like everybody works because economists are we're a useful tool. We can be used by a lot of industries and government and, just look around. But so post-secondary employment, that's going to be I bet that's going to be hot when that thing gets going, because you'll be able to check out how people are doing if they graduated from X school. I haven't had a chance to dig into it, but it's going to be interesting. So
The
question?
There's one of these sources that is linked to employer, right?
Yeah.
Okay, actually.
Okay, so this is
The five one?
what?
Are the five linked employee?
Which one in terms of what are the actual data sets all linked together?
Yeah, are they microdata?
Yeah, now the answer, okay, that's a good point, because we just had Sam from Baruch, but I don't know if that's Sam's last name, I forgot, but he's a professor down at Baruch, and we have a data center. If you want to get the low-level microdata, in some cases like the census, they have what they call a public use microsample. I'm not seeing that they have a public use microsample, but you do have the ability apparently to get access, but you have to go to a sworn center. The Census Bureau is pretty weirdo about security on their data. Does everybody get this? So the example I like to talk about is World War II rolls around. And the Americans decide, well, who are they going to round up? They're going to round up the Japanese, and they're going to put them in internment camps. And the US government says, oh, I'm going to round up all the Japanese. And they say, well, how am I going to find them? And they had just taken, anybody? This is in 41, 42. They had just taken the 1940 census. So they go to the Census Bureau and they say, give me the names of all the Japanese residents of the United States. And the Census Bureau says, we're protected under the Constitution. We don't have to disclose that information to you. And it went all the way to Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, what was the ruling? By the way, the ruling is really fascinating talk about data and morality. The ruling was you could round up as many Japanese citizens as you want and residents as you want. You just can't use the census. So basically, the answer was you can't use the source of data because it is protected. So the census is pretty squirrely about letting out information. So what you can do is get bonded in as a official, officer of the Census Bureau, and then you can go and look at the non-blinded data, the micro data. So I haven't seen the micro data on this one. In 2 weeks, next week, we'll talk about the BLS CEX. I know that very well, and that has a very big micro data sample. The only thing with the micro data sample is I think some of what they call the blinding to release it to the public may alter some of the economics in the data. So then this is what they describe, how they get it, right? They get it from the census, the surveys, and administrative records. Again, they're not real specific, but again, I believe it's the workman's comp stuff. And then obviously they produce a composite data set that has good information about the particular problems. Again, number 3 bullet is important because this is their actually training information, but so as a copy of their slide, but protecting confidentiality is always one of the ones that crops up when you're dealing with them. They are very concerned, like the BLS, like if you go to Seattle, Washington and look for somebody making greater than like $25 million a year, there's 1 or 2 people you're going to find. It's either Jeff Bezos or what's his name? Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, right? So they get kind of crazy about like high income individuals. So what they do is they blind them data. They'll replace the actual observation with a median or a mean for that particular characteristic. So you won't see the full income of Jeff Bezos, but they get real worried about confidentiality. So again, they say they bring the data in from the state partners. They then process the data and they produce these 4 data sets that are useful. They have an extensive online web interface. And again, the level of detail available depends on the level of confidentiality. If they feel that the confidentiality is going to be broken, they'll pull the level of geographic aggregation up a level to keep it confidential. Note the NAICS information. So if you want to study particular workers in particular industries, NAICS, everybody used to NAICS or no? NAICS is the North American Industrial Classification Code. We used to have the SICC codes, Standard Industrial Classification Codes. So here it is. Okay, so the federal government, by the way, stop me anytime I give anything that's an acronym that you don't use. So back, I guess, in the 80s, we got together with the Canadians and the Mexicans because some days we get together and some days we're good and some days we're not so good. We get together and we agreed to have a standard set of industrial classifications. So there are things like the auto industry, there are things like the pharmaceutical industry. It's a little hairy. They have a process by which they establish what industry you're in. You know, and some companies are a little harder to classify, like a GE, you know, that's like, what are you, are you an engine manufacturer? Are you a financial company? But in general, they have a set of standard industrial classification codes. So you can split the data by industry. The other thing is when they talk about the 3- and 4-digit industries, the NAICS code, I believe they use the word, I think they believe it always rhymes with snakes, is NAICS. You can pull down by industry to level. In other words, there's high industry levels like, you know, consumer durables, and then you can break down into like aircraft manufacturing. And then in some cases, they have 3- and 4-digit. So the lower the number, the longer the number, the more details you have, okay? But again, if I was doing anything related to employment, they also have it at the MSA level, which is the basically cities or regions, large metropolitan regions. So again, I think it's really cool. And again, there's multiple extraction tools, both visualization tools, as well as data analysis tools. I will typically rip and run. In other words, I'll go into the data set, grab whatever I want, pull it down, and then I'm a SAS coder. I'm old, so I'm a SAS coder. And I also use geographic information systems. I'll show you just a little bit of that. But I typically rip the data off and then do my own analysis. I don't rely on their, their materials. But there's a bunch of different extraction tools. I would get a raw CSV file or something like that. The journey to journey job flow base is really fascinating. Again, how do people move in their job and employment? One of the things that we're talking about, and we always had questions about this in labor, was, spelling. People will have a job for a period of time, then they leave the job, then what's next and what's next. This data set looks like it has real potential for you to really study that kind of job changing and multiple. One of the arguments is, do changers make more money, right? Do they do better in the job market by hopping, or, and then also geographic changes, which is pretty cool. So the job to job employer seems real interesting. And then obviously, they have the download availability of that. That's how do they describe it? A set of statistics on job mobility in the United States, the job transition rate, hires and separations. That's interesting to note, right? Whose economy is growing at a particular point in time. Origin and destination of job for job transition. So who's moving where? Then the loads data, again, is going to give us a lot of information about how people travel on a day-to-day basis, right? Because where's their job and where's their home? And then you have the secondary employment, which again, I'm really fascinated to see. Earnings and employment outcomes of selected post-secondary institutions. This is going to be I think it's going to be interesting. If this thing is good, this is one of those ones that nobody wants an answer to this question, or a lot of people don't want an answer to this question, but this is going to be interesting to see. I like to poke around in there. And then the quarterly workforce indicators, set of economic indicators, employment, job creation, earnings, that's nice to know about, and other measure of employment flows. And then look at the characteristics we have: geography, industry, age, size, and worker demographics. So we have the age of the company as well as the demographics of the workers: sex, age, education, race, ethnicity. And again, the question is, how low can you go? It would depend upon the actual data source. Go.
Is the information about whether they're immigrant or
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'll take a look, probably in the documentation at the low level, but yeah. That would really be interesting, right? This is just a couple of quick polls I did from it. Worker flows to New York. Where are the worker flows out there? This is J2J data, right? So where are people coming from? So if you pull a worker into New York, typically they're coming from California, Texas. I mean, part of this I would want to normalize for population, right? Because this is just a raw number, but I would typically rip this down. Now you notice the 4 black states, which is it's Arkansas, it's Mississippi, Michigan, and Alaska. They don't disclose. So obviously, if you were doing something that bordered on those, I would be careful, because those states are not reporting. Why they're not reporting is a good question. This is the United States, and we're funky, and the states sometimes don't want to play nice. Maybe it's they don't want to have a lot of discussion about, like, if you're Michigan, maybe you don't want to have a discussion about worker outflows, because probably that's been going on for a while, and maybe you get jazzed up about it. What's this one? This is job to job employments for 400. You have the metro areas, 431 metro areas. So this is a pretty cool level of detail. There's the New York metro area on the upper right there, and obviously seeing the flows of different things. Which one is this one? Forget which one. Here is hires. So you can take a look at hiring activity on a particular quarter. This I just ripped something. This is 2021 quarter 1, but you could take a look at hiring activity in a period of time and watch how different states have hiring activity. In some cases, there may be gaps in disclosure because of the number of observations in a particular area, like the Oklahoma, you notice is popping out. It's not having a lot of reporting. They get nervous at any time the number of observations is low, that you might be able to identify an individual, and then they'll suppress the data, which you might be able to work around. What's this one? Oh, this is job separations, leaving your job. So again, these are all pretty neat ideas, pretty neat things you might want to consider. That's the LEHD data. Any thoughts?
So that's all public, right, and available right now?
And the price is 0. And when you see Dr. Portland's coming next week, when you meet these people, you realize like you can actually call them. Like that was one of the things I really learned in grad school that you should do. Like these people are excited that you're using their data. Like they believe in you. Like I want to make this clear. They believe in you. So like they're excited that you're calling them. So like they actually have all this documentation and they're the technical experts. You don't go to them and call them with crazy questions. First, spend some time working with them. But in my experience with Census Bureau and BLS, they've been very interested in hearing what we're doing because we attack problems sometimes they don't have time for. I study transportation at a level that they don't usually do. I study tolling systems, which are very regional in the United States, but have impacts, big impacts, and they're interested in the results. Next week, when you hear BLS has a now it's going to be an online seminar every summer that's free, that you can participate in both as presenting work if you're using their data, as well as participate just to sit in and listen to what people are doing in the field. But yeah, that's the cool part is the documentation is there and the people involved. A lot of this data, because it's paid for by the federal government, is out there for you and me. And that was always my problem. I never had any money to buy data, so I always had to find cheap ways to go.
Do you use any particular directory of contacts for each data set?
Yeah, they have a listed problem, and I'd be happy to send you, like, they have listed, like, if you go to the LOADS data set or the LEHD data set, they'll have particular experts.
Okay.
And then we can shuttle around too. Like, if I have a BLS problem, I had a BLS problem, Dr. Poland's coming next week. I call him if I have something like in particular, and he'll shunt me to whoever at the organization does whatever we're talking about. All right.
And the PSEO data that was said it was experimental, so it's released, but it's not. What's it missing?
Well, you know, it's funny. So, okay. Again, I started off saying that I used to think there was nothing for us to do. Like I thought all the good papers are written. There's nothing left for us to do. And everything's been written. And, you know, AC Pagoo wrote the great paper and there's no work left to do. And the answer is there's a ton of stuff to do because there's so many things we don't know about. And so when we talk about these particular data sources, they're certainly going to give us insight that is helpful to a particular set of problems. And you just have to think about what's the right piece of research you want to do.
But it's a valid data set because it said experimental.
In the experimental piece. So what happens is, it's just like us doing research. They start off with stuff and they go, okay, like the census, like they count people, right? You know, like they've been doing that for 250 years, right? So they do that. They know how to do that. But then they get something like this, they figure out a tweak on it and they go, oh, wait a second, we can also do X. But there's a lot of statisticians, you know, we're economists and they're statisticians, right? Wim, I don't know, how do you describe, is there a difference between the two groups? The statisticians get very squirrely about sample size and sample frame and correct collection of data. And they get all weirdo. If anything is not like this, they're kind of like, oh, maybe. So they'll say, yes, probably right. But I'm only at 92% confidence interval. I really need to get to 95 plus before I can say, yes, it is. It's probably, they're still poking with it. They figured out that they could pull it out. They release it as experimental because they think it's something interesting. They're probably not 100% confident. Okay, this is one you want. You're not going to believe this one. So I've been working with the U.S. Commerce Department. The Commerce Department, the BEA, Bureau of Economic, is BEA, I think it's Commerce Department, Bureau of Economic Analysis. I believe it's Commerce Department. The Americans don't have a good grip on tourism. I want to say that again. The Americans don't have a good grip on tourism. Like the whole industry of tourism, it's kind of sketchy. And the reason it's sketchy is because like they count washing machines. Does everybody know this? Like when you look at the GDP numbers, right? The Americans are great at counting like washing machines and like refrigerators and like, you know, stuff that's physical objects like furniture. But when they get into services, it all gets real mucky. And like they have a hard time separating activity, like restaurant activity. When is restaurant activity at home and when is it on travel? And they're really weak on the recreational and like tourism industry. Like how much money do people spend on bicycling? How much money do people spend on hiking? How much money do people spend on, you know, RVs? You know, they've been working on that recently. Like I talked to BEA about, because they want to count it in GDP, because in some states, it's a big deal, like in Colorado and, Washington State and Alaska. Alaska with COVID, man, like their economy went in a total toilet because they have a huge economy built on recreation, but yet the statistics are real weak. So they've been trying to get their handle on that. All right. So I think it's going to be around. That's my suspicion. I think they're just probably the statisticians at Census are probably running around and yelling, saying, no, it's not 100% right. All right, the ZCTA data. Now, this is one I've used a lot, so I'm going to give you a lot more insight and details on this one because I've used this one a lot. Now, I'm assuming if you're going to do any work, now you're doing spatial analysis. Dr. Weiberberg is doing spatial econometrics, and he and I were just talking about geographies, right? Because spatial means it's arranged, and then you get into what does it mean arranged. And in our world, we live with these certain types of geographies, right? Some of them are political, some of them are physical, like an island is a physical geography. But these are kind of the from the top to the bottom, from the bigger to the smaller, right? Are different types of things. And now some of them are legally designated, like a state boundary in the US or a country boundary, right? Amazingly enough, by the way, some countries don't know where the boundaries are. We know that, right? You know that they're still fighting. The Canadians and the Americans still don't have all the boundaries resolved. Right now, to this day, they're fighting over an island off of Maine. And there's some stuff off Washington that they're not really clear about. Then you have regions, of course, the Northeast, the Southwest, right? Then you have your states, we know about the states. Then you have your counties. That's probably one of the big, legal boundaries. Then you have your census tracts. Now that's designated by the Census Bureau, right? For the purposes of collecting data. And then you have the blocks, which is our lowest level, right? Stuff. The problem is, first of all, and when I talk about the stuff from Brown, that's the longitudinal, the Census Bureau makes me crazy. They change the blocks. Over time, they change the blocks. So you come back in 2 years, 10 years, and they're different blocks. So then they have a hard time lining them up. But the one I'm going to talk about today is zip codes. Now, zip codes is one of those things that you don't think a lot about, right? But it's a very useful geography for you and me. And there's a reason for that. First of all, it's an odd geographical boundary. Does everybody know that? If you ever looked at the zip code map, it's a strange map. The reason is the map is developed by the US Postal Service for the purposes of routing delivery trucks. That's why the zip codes are the way they are. They have delivery trucks and they have to assign the delivery trucks to a certain location and they have to deliver the mail there and then send it out to the zip codes. And it's based upon the mail delivery needs. Now, I want you to make this an important point. Zip codes are really, really neat if you're working in an urban dense zone. Because like in a New York City or New York metro area, zip codes are small. You look at Utah, they're a little bigger, right? So when you're in New York City, they're real small. Now, the US Census Bureau takes and collects the data on the US Census, and they use the tract and the block. And the data that most people are going to touch on a regular basis is tract and block. But I found the ZCTA code about 15 years ago, and the ZCTA data is really useful from my perspective because it's easy to combine with other sources, other information. And the ZCTAs are a little bit different, just a little bit different than the zip codes. Why? Because you have two sets of geographies you got to line up, and I'll give you these slides. You all can look at these slides and read them in detail. So the census goes out, they send their mail instrument, right? They get them back, and each survey is coded to a tract and a block, right? And has everybody looked at the census? The FIPS code, I think it is, right? The FIPS code, the standard. It's like 18 characters long numeric, which 36 would be New York and 34 is New Jersey. And then it goes on and on all the way down to the block. They have to bring the data back in and then they have to adjust it because what will happen is there are blocks that cross zip code boundaries. So then what they do is they have this whole process here by which they assign a particular block to a particular zip code. So it's not exactly the same, but I use it all the time because it's close enough from what I'm doing mostly. I find it doesn't seem to be a big thing. As a matter of fact, I can reassemble sometimes, like I'll reassemble counties out of the zip codes. And it's not the exact county, but it's pretty darn good. Okay, and I'll show you some examples of that. So what they do is they then look at the census block and they look at where most of the zip codes in the survey results are. They assign that block, that zip code. And then if they have some that don't have them more frequently observed, then they have the rule about the length of the boundary. Whoever has the longest boundary on the zip code then gets the data. But at the end of the day, they produce a data set that essentially has some really interesting characteristics for us. All right, so now I just want to emphasize again, I tend to not do surveys. Why don't I do surveys? I don't do I don't know, you don't survey, you don't do much survey work right anymore, Wim? I used to do some survey work. I don't do survey work anymore. One, I've got to go to IBR, my institutional review board. RRB, takes too long, makes me annoyed, waste my time, right? Waste resources. Two, I gotta go then administer the survey. What's the problem with that?
It's a lot of work.
Well, how's it? I mean, you can do a bad survey easily, right? That's relatively, let's put it on SurveyMonkey. That's it. I'll do all my work on SurveyMonkey. What's the problem with all of that? You do that stuff. You go with SurveyMonkey as your main source. Are you getting the right data? Are you collecting the right data? Do you have the right sampling frame? Are you actually getting a representative sample? All of this we hog over to the Census Bureau. We let the statisticians down there who worry about the experimental stuff. They have statisticians there. Believe me, the BLS, I've talked to them at length. They are worrying about stuff I never even get in my head. Like they are worrying about how they got response rate. They were sweating it during COVID because they were collecting data during COVID and they were trying to make sure that they got demographic representative sample during COVID. So you have confidentiality problems. But the thing is, most of your survey work, if you have some data out there that was collected by somebody, most times if it's a mailing instrument, it has zip code associated with it. Plus, there's a lot of secondary data that has billing information. Your Visa bill has the billing, it has a zip code on it, right? Here's an example, one I've done. Municipal records. You can FOIA. What's FOIA? Anybody use FOIA? Yeah, have you used it yet or no? It's a pain, but it's good. FOIA is you go to the entity and say, I want this data, make it public to me. And it's called freedom of information, and it's pretty strong in the US. Different states have different rules as well for their state records. But for instance, you can FOIA New York City vehicle registrations by zip code. They will not release your address, but if I give them a plate number, they will give me what zip code is registered to. Now that's considered enough protection for, from issues related to privacy, right? But they will release the zip code, which is, of course, for us is pretty cool, very useful. Question? Okay. So that's an example of where I've used it. And of course, those will line up with the ZCTA data. So I can line up municipal records with ZCTA data. And then obviously that's what I do further once we get into it.
Sorry, Professor Pierce, can we share screen?
Yeah, sorry, that's, go ahead. My apologies.
Professor,
Yes.
my name is Emmanuel. Thank you for this very instructive presentation. If you have information at zip code level or ZCTA, I understand that not all the ZCTAs, there are 3 ZCTAs in Queens that cross boundaries between New York and Nassau County. And something similar could be happening with the zip codes, right? How do you manage that situation with this data? Can you retrieve data at New York City level and compare that with the ZCTA level, or do you do some special, let's say, arrangement to capture the portion of the ZCTA that belongs to New York City and not to Nassau County? Thank you.
No, I could think about it, and I'm trying to remember if I had a crossing one. And again, when I said I reassembled the county, one way you do it is you assemble it by an approximation of the county. Now you've got to decide, and what you're doing is how much that particular problem will alter your, potentially produce risk for your analysis, right? In a lot of cases, if it's a contiguous zone, the demographics kind of bend along, right? They don't radically shift a lot of times based on it. It's a political boundary you're talking about, right? Between Nassau and so New York State county boundary. You could summarize by using a map of the county and pull the zip codes, the ZCTA codes into the boundary that was most, like typically I'll use called the centroid, the middle point or the balancing point. That's how I would deal with that. And you will have a little roughness on the edge. You're worried about an edge difference, right?
Yes.
I'm trying to think. I see it wouldn't be as much problem. Zip codes typically, I don't think cross state boundaries. And I believe they have a FIPS code as well. I have to look at the data. And if I was worried about that problem, take a look in detail, but it's a good question. Let me keep it there and let's think about it.
Thank you.
No, my pleasure. The other thing is that you have pretty fine geography, especially for work in New York. If you're thinking about doing something in New York, we have a lot of zip codes. I think we have 700 zip codes in the region. So this is a map. What I did was I pulled the ZCTA level data. You can get it down. Actually, it's funny, NBER has it. NBER has the actual data sets pulled out from Census Bureau, and I've been using that. I have the whole United States here lit up. This is in a GIS software. This is in ArcGIS, which is Esri's product. I use that on a regular basis. So what I've done is you get a map, a ZCTA map file from the Census Bureau. I have the link in the presentation for you. And then you merge the two. And now what I'm showing here, color intensity indicates population. Okay, so the intensity of color indicates the population. You, of course, could create population density and stuff like that as well. Just to give you a little feel. So for a fun little exercise to show you one of the things I do on a regular basis, I've given you 4 CUNY campuses here. I put in Queensboro, I located Queensboro, I located Lehman, I located the GC where we sit, and I located CSI, my home institution. And then what I did was I used one of the characteristics and again, this is for you with spatial econometrics, right? I've done a bunch of work where I want to say, what are the people proximate to a particular location, toxic waste dump, bus garage, I'm trying to think, any sort of thing that relates to amenities and disamenities, who can walk to parks, right? So you put your geography in, and I just located those facilities. And then in GIS, I did a selection where I pulled everything within a 2-mile walk, a 2-mile distance of the facility. So then what it did, now I pulled based on the centroid, meaning that was the middle geography of the area. And I selected all those things. So now I can do a breakdown, who has access. There's one big one, schooling, who has access to schools, who has access to public amenities, libraries, parks, all this stuff. Now, once I do that, I can quickly rip that data out to Excel or another statistical platform and do any sort of analysis I want to do on the haves and the have-nots. You can also then pull out the ones that aren't covered, right? So this is around Queensboro. I pulled around Queensboro, and those were the zip codes that popped out when I ripped. I think this addresses your problem, correct? Now I have to put in the Queens border, right? Because Queensboro is way out on the Nassau County border. And I think the one on the upper right, the 17728 and 11021 are both in Nassau County. I'm pretty sure they are. Now, the question would be, do you want to include them or not, right? And you could apply in a second poll on it, right? And say, exclude anything outside the borough of Queens. If I put the border of Queens and say anything outside of it, exclude. But in this case, now it was a centroid poll. And so that meant I pulled the ones that had their geographic center within the distance of the facility. But then, of course, it's real cool because then I can actually do the detailed analysis poll. This is down by Philly. And this is the zip codes that are around Philly. And you see, you get a pretty good level of detail, right? From the zip codes, even in an area like Philly, in South Jersey, you get quite a bit of a separation. And each one of those, if you go to the NBER's website, each one of those data series, there's multiple, there's ethnicity, gender, age, lots of stuff. I think there's 27 different data sets all pulled together on ZCTA basis.
Are these shape files that you download from?
Yep.
From Census and run GIS?
Cool. Yeah, there's a little bit of a hassle with merging it because zip codes are a pain in the neck. They have leading zeros. And that makes your merge a little more of a pain. And GIS, anybody, if you're not doing this, this is geographic information systems. This is cranky. And I'm from SAS world, and SAS is very rugged. It's a pain. SAS is unpleasant, but rugged. You know what I mean? Like you have to work with it. It's a coding type language and you got to do your thing. I guess R is pretty sketchy though. I don't know. Is R pretty rugged or sketchy? And it's.
You gotta take care that you don't make mistakes.
No, I don't, that I get. I mean, because I'm an old programmer for a long time. Like people make coding mistakes. But SAS is pretty rugged in terms of actually ability to handle data. Like that machine over there has handled 26 million records on SAS and didn't really cough. The GIS is very temperamental. Let's just leave it at that. It does cool things, but it'll be a hassle. So I tend to do most of my analysis in one of the statistical programs, and then I feed this a nicely formatted data set to map. I don't do a lot. Some people do a lot because this has, you could do Python programming in this thing, but I don't tend to do that. Now here's the population count. So then you can pull the population counts. And again, I just have population here, but they have ethnicity, they have age, so you would just bring in the right data that would go along with it. So here's San Francisco, again, pretty fine granularity out there in terms of the number of zip codes that are available. Here's the source at the NBER. I'll make that available to you. Data is not available for 2020 yet, still processing it. 2010 is available, including map files and the data itself. That's the link for NBER. There's the Tiger line. That's the link for the Tiger line files. There's the link for it. So I make most of my bones. This is where I do my research nowadays, is I make most of my bones doing value added research. I go out and find some stuff that, again, the census data, everybody knows about it. But again, if you ask somebody their census block, nobody knows their census block. Pretty much everybody knows their zip code, yes? So if you're doing a survey, you're probably going to get a good answer on the survey. And it allows you to then do a lot of metrics. I do a lot of work on social justice. And so zip codes are a pretty low level of geography. Again, people don't even know their counties, you know what I mean? They know their zip codes probably more than they know their counties. But a lot of municipal data is collected at the zip code level, a lot of the stuff that might want to use. And again, it's a pretty low level of aggregation. So this is a map, this is a diagram, nothing great, but I took it out of this book here, Environmental Justice, which has been through the ringer. That shows you what my book's like. This thing's been all over the place. There's lots of books out there on this stuff. I do a lot of work on social justice, right? And I don't know, what do we call it in economics? What do you guys call it in economics now? I use social justice. Is that a good one? Or inequality? Well, inequality to me is income related, right? See, social justice, any Europeans here? Any Europeans? The Europeans use the term social inclusion. More positive term, in other words. And I can spend all day talking about racial versus income, but I tend to use the term social justice. In the book there, they have some different ideas about, so some of them flow together, like the nation to the block, right? Because they pretty much adhere to those rules. Like, in other words, a block doesn't cross a state line, you know what I mean? Or a tract doesn't cross a state line. Other ones like the zip codes kind of come right out at the top there, where you have national numbers and then you have these codes. So if we're going to use zip codes, we then have to you can re-aggregate it into a state or re-aggregate it into a particular geography. And again, what's interesting, and I just pulled this out quick so you can see it. This is the count of the number of different things. It's an administrative. There's about 40,000 zip codes in the United States. There's about 7 million. I cut it off at the bottom. There's about 7 million blocks. So again, that's a much smaller detail. Tracts, there's about 50,000 tracts in the United States, census tracts. So zip codes are pretty close to tracts, right? They're not too bad in terms of the number of codes. And again, it's certainly better than working with something like the MSA. The MSA, there's only 300 of them. I work again a lot with BLS, and BLS has they're like 16 or 18 major cities they report data on, and the rest of it's just the rest of the US. But again, the details that are in here, obviously it provides to me a pretty useful level of geography. Again, incorporated places, right? There's a lot of incorporated places, but again, the boundaries of those are kind of sometimes harder to get your hands on. The one that's funny, by the way, is New York City. If you grow up in New York City, so I grew up in New York City, right? Where do you live in New York City? When somebody asks you where do you live, what do you say? What do you say to somebody?
Brooklyn.
You say Brooklyn, you say your county, and you say your borough, right? Queens is different though, because Queens people say, anybody?
Regal Park.
Regal Park.
Astoria.
Wait, it's the one borough that's different, yes or no? The other, Queens used to be part of Nassau. They chewed it off, whatever. Queens still has their towns, right? You'll say, I'm from Flushing. By the way, they address that way too, correct?
Yeah.
They address Flushing. The other boroughs, none of the other boroughs do that. Everybody else is the Bronx, New York, Manhattan, or NY. But these different areas, right? When you talk about their actual geography, people generally are going to have a good sense of place. In New York City, they actually have an official map of the non-existent towns. Does everybody know that? In other words, Flushing doesn't exist other than the zip code. Bay Ridge, what are the boundaries of Bay Ridge? There's a zip code in Bay Ridge, yes. But there's no official there is an official boundary map.
There's the neighborhood.
There's a they've made official boundaries for these non-official areas. So if you want to work on Queens versus you want to work on Rockaways versus Flushing, there's a map of the boundaries of Flushing. By the way, people argue about their boundaries. I don't live in Bay Ridge. I live in Sunset Park, right? There's an official map that you should get your hands on if you want to do any work on that
But
type of stuff.
this map would change every 6 months.
It may, but the one I'm using is from New York City Planning. I don't think it does. I think they sat down one day in a room and they have a map of these non-existent towns, and now we have these non-existent towns. All right, so this is one example. I'll give you a couple examples. Oh, go ahead. Question? Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple examples of the work that I've done with ZCTA codes. One of them is I'm studying tolling, and I've been studying what's called social justice and equity. And one of the things we always talk about is taxation burden. Well, when I say the word burden to you, what does that mean? I don't know if anybody's in public. Are you in public finance or anybody in public economics? So we put a tax in place, right? Taxes can be either progressive or regressive. Yes, we all got it. My friends, all my right-wing friends get wacky crazy when I say this to them. It's a progressive tax. It's a technical term for us, right? Yes or no, right? What does a progressive tax mean? Burden of costs goes up as income rises, and a regressive tax, what? Give me some regressive and progressive taxes. Sales tax. Sales tax are regressive. Why? Because poor people spend all their money, and Bill Gates doesn't spend 2/3 of his money, and therefore he doesn't pay much in the way of sales tax, and the poor person pays everything in the sales tax, right? Property taxes are probably regressive. Wim, do you think they're regressive? They're probably regressive because high income households don't buy that much. I can tell you gasoline tax is definitely regressive. I know that, okay, from my data. Why? Higher income households buy about twice as much gasoline as a low income household. However, what?
Their income is.
They have like the 16 times the income. So yes, they do spend some more. Liquor tax is regressive. Lotteries, whether or not it's a tax or not, that's regressive generally. Low income households, see, rich people don't buy lottery tickets because they already won them. They already won the lottery. They don't need to buy a ticket. So I studied regressivity and burden, right? So like transit fares, and in this case, road pricing, tolls. So what we did was we pulled out of the data. At this point in time in 2006, when this was published, there was no 2010 data. There was only 2000 data, but we used the ZCTA data. We pulled out 700 zip codes. We had obtained from the tolling agency the billing information that had been obtained by a newspaper via a FOIA request. So we call it in the term of disgorgement, right? Because these entities want to help you or no? These public entities want to release their information? No. What you need to do is you need to go up and you need to grab them, yes? And you need to keep jumping up and down on them until they release what you want, yes? And it's not going to be a pleasant day. We scare them. Do you understand that we scare them? Do you understand this? Anybody been a bureaucrat in a government agency?
No, you're close.
I was an elected official for 15 years, okay? Why do we scare them? Why do we as a group scare them? Does anybody know? You don't know? Bureaucrats love order. And they don't like people who are going to cause trouble. Professor Weiberberg and me are really bad because we're tenured professors. A, we're smart. B, we tend to get interested in things. And once we're interested, what? We're not going away. C, we don't really have to, like people ask me, how long have you been working on tolling? I don't know, 25 years, So when we show up and ask for something, they tend to freak out. Why do you want this? We can't give it to you. Jump up and down on them, they release the data. So this is the Easy Pass tags. Got it? This is the data on how much money they collected by Easy Pass. And what we did was we plotted out the amount of money collected by zip code. Okay. Now, in the ZCTA data, I have the household income. Okay. That's the per capita number. Now, it's always interesting in income, right? Because you're going to get into questions of income, right? When we talk about the word income, they use median. That's a crock of a metric. Why? That hides Richie Rich. Because median gives you like the middle value, but when you go to an area that's really skewed, Richie Rich has got a lot of income. That's the Lorenz curve. It's got that huge amount of lift on that last bit of data. Look at New Jersey. Where does Richie Rich live? Rich lives up in the mountains. Does everybody see that? They live up in the center of New Jersey. Those dark blue areas around Morristown is where the rich people live in New Jersey. Yes? Okay, so let's tax them. No. The data says no, because the Richie Rich doesn't have toll roads. So Richie Rich doesn't pay as much. Everybody got it? So this is one of those findings that, when you start to do this, so then we could do comparison by zip code, area, income. And the question is, why are you raising the tolls? In the case of New Jersey, they raised the tolls to subsidize transit right now. So you're taking money from moderate income households and moving it. By the way, does anybody know what the transit riders look like in the state of New Jersey? If you're on a bus, you're poor. What? You're a transit rider. So am I. I rode in the transit. Wait a second. If you look at it, you pull out my paper, just who should pay for what? Ready for this? The average income of a Jersey transit rider is 110,000 bills. Train rider. Bus is full of poor people. Trains are full of rich people. Because the train system, if you look at the map, and I have it, I think I have it. Okay, so then we could do geographic dispersion of income and tolling burden, right? Because this, you would think if it's progressive, what happened? As income rises, the burden goes up. Not, that doesn't look like it, yes or no? I don't know, what would you do with that, Professor Biberberg? You got anything or no? That's a nasty one. There's not much there, right? This is per capita per capita burden and income. Again, not much of a relationship. This we ripped down and recreated the counties. Everybody got it? I reassembled the zip codes into the counties using a map and pulled them all back together. And then I could get the number of accounts. I could get the household burden, per capita burden, and the average toll they pay. Yes?
So Cumberland pays the most toll. Average.
Now, it gets interesting. Where is it? Well, let's per capita. Let's look at per capita. Union has $32. Gloucester is Hudson 34. No, it's Monmouth, and it's Monmouth and Middlesex per capita. Right?
Okay.
Now, this is a good question. What is the metric of measurement of burden, right? Because if you're an elected official, do you want your people paying for something, or do you want somebody else to pay?
Someone else.
Right. So if you're a county politician here, you would look at this and not like the per capita burden of Middlesex and Monmouth at 46 and 47 a person. And then you would like to see, you'd like to be like Sussex, right? The people up in northwestern New Jersey, they don't pay any tolls because they don't have any toll roads near them. But what's interesting about it, when you look at a map, there's two toll roads in New Jersey. There's two big toll roads in New Jersey. There's the Garden State Parkway and the Jersey Turnpike. The Garden State Parkway goes along the left, and it's the only highway in the area. The Jersey Turnpike goes on the west. Is everybody to the right? The west is the Jersey Turnpike. The Jersey Turnpike in South Jersey has a parallel free road, 295. Okay, do the locals know that? By the way, it's actually a wealthier part of the state, right?
Yes.
Apparently the people in South Jersey know, because when you look at the burden chart, they don't pay that much. They route around. This is a good quality free route. They route around. We found the same phenomena, by the way, with the Queens Midtown Tunnel. Queens Midtown Tunnel has the 59th Street Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge near it. Guess who's not in the tunnel? Poor people are not in the tunnel. Only the rich people go in the tunnel because they go. They just pay, right? But again, this is the kind of geospatial analysis that really kind of gets interesting. And again, then the second one I did was we did a study of the MTA bridges in New York using the ZCTA data. We got a survey. Again, this is a good one. I should have brought it. With me today. I have the book. So my buddy, the co-author with me, Professor Gordon out in Australia, he found a survey on the street. And this is a lesson to you all. If you're going to do FOIA, right, you have to write to the agency. And let me say I asked for the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority user survey. They'll write you back and say, we don't have that. We don't have a user survey. No, they didn't have a user survey. They had a travel survey. And they won't bother to say to you, oh, by the way, we had a travel survey. They'll just say, we don't have a user survey. He found it. He found the actual survey. I'll bring it next week. He had found the actual survey in the garbage can. And then we had it because we photocopied it and said, what? I want the data from this. Okay. And then what? Then it was a lot harder to avoid, right? So the data is fascinating. Now, this is sample data. They collected a sample. okay? Now, I could go out and collect my own sample data. They had collected the data, right? What was interesting about it was I could then do some analysis work. The sample, they had 600,000 surveys sent out. They sent out 300,000 in paper copies. And they got, ready for this, 64,000 responses. The data set has 64,000 responses. Now, can you and I afford that? First of all, how long would it take to get 64,000 responses? And it's a paper survey, then you got to code it, right? Yeah, right, exactly. So when you say this, you just go, wow. And I got this through writing a letter and leaning on them for a year, like 6 months. Yes, that's how you get it. So we could do some real cool stuff. So one of the first things was who should be using a particular road? And we used the argument, well, it should be the people who live around it because they're there. So we used GIS to punch it. Now that is a ZCTA map, right? And we punched, and the punches are 3 different punches. The blue punch is the Verrazano Bridge. The red punch is the Queens Midtown Tunnel, and the green punch is the Throgs Neck Bridge. They're all in slightly different locations, right? But we punched. Once you punched, you could then pop the data out of ZCTA. And I could rip it out and then analyze it. And there's the number of households and there's the population. You notice the Verrazano has the lowest number of households, the lowest number of population, a lot of water. Got it? The big chunk of the circle. Now I could use another method. I could have done something, but I used a punch. It was pretty straightforward. And then, of course, what's cool about it is then you can compare the survey data, which came from the survey, the 64,000 observations, with the demographic data. And that's it right there. Does anybody have any commentary, the economists? If that doesn't horrify you, I don't know what will. The survey was broken. By the way, this is always great when you get into income surveys, right? Because they put out the breaks. The top break was 150 plus. This is in 2004. 150 plus. That they seem to never go high enough. They never go like the newest one. I have a newer one that goes like 250, 500. First of all, 1/3 of the people in the New York metro region are low income. 1/3. Yes. Bridge users, what? A big chunk of the toll bridge users, because it's expensive to travel on these facilities, are high income, moderate, 20%, make them north of 150.
Yes.
And then, of course, it gets interesting because the breakdown, we could then take successive punches at 3. I did 5, 10, 15. We found out that 65% of the spending occurred within 15 miles of the bridge. I have 44 states in this data. 65% of the spending and costs fell out within 15 miles of the bridge. And it varied by location. So I then was able to calculate the Lorenz curves. Yes, I plotted out the income distribution of each of the groups. And this was the actual bridges. The other one is, this is the punches. Remember I showed you the 3 different punches? First of all, I wasted my time doing 13 punches. And I did 13, I think it's 13. I can look at the chart. I think it's 13 or 11. I did 13 punches, pulled all the data, and this is what the Lorenz curves looks like. Anybody have any commentary for me?
Awesome.
What a freaking waste of time. Yes or no? But
They are
What?
all correlated.
in the world of research, what? You must know. You cannot assume, correct? We cannot assume they're the same. Now I know they're the same. So I wasted all the time constructing all the Lorenz curves. And the Lorenz curves and the Gini coefficients are almost exactly the same for the people who live around the bridge. And there's a real interesting demographic question about that, because if you go back and look at the punches, what you'll notice is the Throgs Neck, or the Throgs Neck there on the far right, grabbed more of Northern Long Island, right? And that, of course, is anybody? That's a higher income group, right? And excluded more of Jersey City and Newark. Does everybody see it? The punch shifted left, whereas the Verrazano punch grabbed more Newark and say Perth Amboy and Central New Jersey. So what happened was, again, this is probably, it's just an anomaly, right? There's no proof, there's no guarantee of this, right? That you would shift your geography and the demographics would stay the same. It just seems like in the New York Metro, there's a heterogeneity of the region. And as you shift around it, the pieces tend to wash each other out. I don't know, right? They seem to do that. They do. I mean, the data does, but we did check. So it wasn't like I just assumed it wasn't there. So I did that for all the different bridges. And of course, the thing you can figure out then is you can figure out what was the burden, right? And again, this comes back to what we do with environmental justice there. Sorry, my apologies, 61,201 vehicles in the survey. And, so that's how we used it. I mean, it was really interesting. It took me a year and a half. I guess it's gonna be a year and a half to get the data out of them. The other thing, of course, you can do is a bigger scale map. This is a map that shows the scale, the tolling across the region, 3 states there. And of course, what's kind of cool is the way that the data, the facilities are all located here, right? All the facilities are right in here, yes? And what's really cool, I don't know, are you a fan of data? Like when I get data and I see, look at the fan, right? And the intensity, right? The gray is the yellow is no activity in that zip code. And then the gray is the lower activity, and then the orange and green are the higher activities. And again, I just think it's just kind of arty, right? Isn't it? Because you know nothing to the. I don't know if it's this one. Okay, one of the other things we did was we did. The owl's gone to sleep or something. That's it.
It's fine.
Okay, we could map out the burden by geography, by different areas. And so we had radically different burden in different parts of the region. So I mean, that's it. Those are the kinds of things you can do with it. You can do it by zip code, summarize it up. And we actually then would calculate the Lorenz curve. So there's basically it. I'll spend a little bit more time, but this is what the raw data looks like. And I'm happy to answer any questions. What do you think? Yes? Are you ready to go? What are you gonna do?
I'll just think a little bit about this survey we were talking about.
Which one?
300,000 surveys with 60,000 responses.
Right. Yeah.
Who received the survey? Like who was the survey dedicated?
Okay, so the agency did the survey, right? The agency said, we're gonna wanna, and you wanna produce it. Now, this is one of those things. I don't know, I spend my time trying to find stuff that nobody else has. Like, there's this whole thing in data nowadays that everything's open data. Is that the world? They keep talking, I see, I'm a specialist in getting data nobody else has, because new data and standard techniques, which I did very standard techniques here, right? Produces interesting results. So they did the survey for their own purposes. Now, what's funny is they didn't analyze the data the way I did. Because partially, does the agency want to release data that shows geographic inequality and geographic burdens? No. Senator so-and-so, Congressman so-and-so, Assembly person so-and-so, if they hear their constituents are going to get a higher burden, they're going to want to talk about that at the state level and say, shouldn't we have a rule? Like, for instance, in the Rockaways, ready for this? They have a discount program for people who live in the Rockaways. Not because there's a reason, but just because the political pressure, and they claim these people are aggrieved, and Staten Island has a discount program, and there are different things that go on. So they took the survey, they did all this work. This survey got a tombstone. I can show you the research they did with the survey, and it was like the highest level, like skim of just like reporting on basic results. Like, they didn't do the income distribution. By the way, they didn't do any comparators to the other parts of the region, right? They didn't compare their user base to they didn't talk about that. They just left that unsaid. They did a survey, and then they did reports and just, released very smattering, this is a smattering of information. When we saw the actual survey, we knew what we could do with it, because we could pull down into that lower level geography and also pull into the, the differences between region, right? So that's where a lot of times the agencies won't do the work. That's their solution. They do the survey because they have to, they get the results. If the results don't look like what they're thinking, they give it a tombstone, but it still exists. You and I can find it.
I'm kind of thinking like, how do you avoid the bias in this type of situation, right? So you send 300,000 surveys, you receive 60 back. How do you know who responded? Because there might be some bias who tend to respond to the survey and who.
Yeah, no, this is one of those questions, because they're collecting the data. If there was a bias in it, there's a possibility that there could be some unevenness in it, right? Because did they get responses from everybody? I don't know, right? And they had a consultant who ran the survey for them. It must have been $2 to $3 million contract to collect this much data, had to be. What you can say is you have 44 states. So they did get quite a bit of coverage across the country. So they got responses from quite a range of users. So then you got to look at, I guess, again, you don't have the sampling frame, right? They gave it out on a particular number of days to a particular number of users. Do you think they did a pretty good outreach in terms of survey dispersal? Most mail surveys don't get a huge response rate, right? 10%, 50%,
20% is decent.
20% is decent.
But
So-
there's a lot of self-selection.
There is self-selection in it, and that's the other reality. Now, of course, we could use a better data source, like the data on the first survey, which came from the tags. Right? Because that's not a sampling procedure. If I get them to disgorge the tag results, how many transactions occurred and how many, that first one on the Jersey situation, that was using the mechanically recorded data.
It must be different, like sometimes we need to run certain balance check to be more assured that this survey is actually representative.
The other piece of it is, with the tag data, you don't have demographics. You wouldn't get from somebody's billing information what the demographics is, whereas the survey had the demographics. So I guess, again, right, I mean, there is potential for that to slip in there. I would say the sample size helps us, right? Because having a large sample size is generally helpful to any sort of anomalies. So, I don't know, what else, any other thoughts? I mean, it's good, I'm not the econometrician on this. I have to think about it.
When it comes to the data, so the LEHD data, you said is census given, so you could aggregate it up from the census blocks up to a county level, no
Yeah.
problem, cleanly.
Yeah.
The ZCTA though is at the zip code level, right? So that's where you're gonna have some issues in making that a clean.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And the flip side of it is, I mean, if you didn't use the ZCTA data and you had information that was zip code level, you'd have to do your own aggregation. I prefer to use the Census Bureau. See, in my general experience, I prefer to have an expert, because I do litigation work, right? I would prefer to tell the judge that I used the Census Bureau's maps as opposed to saying I made maps from the block level data. I would rather be able to hide behind the Census Bureau and say they did all the work, so.
So they have that already then, so.
I'll give you the slides and they have all the maps already available. Yeah, so that's a real cool asset to have at your hands. And again, this is stuff that you can download today and start working with tomorrow. And the cost is zero. Everything I'm showing, I think, is zero, which is not insignificant, right, in the game. But the other thing is, don't underestimate the fact that your analysis can be of significant value. The BLS continues to talk to me. I've been going there for 7 years with them, because I look at their data differently than they do. They have to produce standardized reports. They have standard things that come out every month, and they have standard, reporting of. See, we'll do stuff when you talk about like those experimental data sets. We'll do stuff that scare them, because they wouldn't be willing to either use the sample size, or they wouldn't be willing to do the aggregation, or they'd be worried about it, and they'd have months of internal review that would go on before they released any sort of information. You and I can fly a little wilder just using our own technical capabilities, right? Census Bureau is a federal agency. They're paranoid that Senator so-and-so, she's gonna get this report and it's gonna say something bad about her district. And she'll be flipping out at them and saying, you gotta pull the census funding, and so they get all weird. We don't get weird about it because we could care less, right, about what results come out. If it doesn't show what the Census Bureau doesn't want to have political controversy, there's 100 senators and there's 435 congressional representatives, and the Census Bureau sweats them all. So that's where we can do a lot of stuff. They actually will probably like a lot of our stuff if we do our work well, but they can't do it always. It's not politically feasible, like ethanol subsidies by state. that would be one that would raise so many red flags. All the Iowa, Nebraska senators would be just flipping out. They don't even want to talk about it. I think I found an anomaly in the funding formula that is racially biased. And I don't want to tell it all because I want to write the paper on it, but I believe I have found a racially biased and geographically biased error in the, not an error, it's a statistical property of the funding formula in transportation that is biased against 4 states and minorities. Now, again, why has this never been dealt with? Probably because certain states benefit from these funds and other states don't want, they don't want to open this discussion up because it's just not gonna put them forward, give them the right things they want to hear. So they just don't do it, right? So, but great. Anything else? I'm happy to answer questions, but school data sets, and hopefully you come back and we'll talk more about the BLS should be fun. Jeffrey Poland is very knowledgeable if you want to learn about this. The next set of data is the consumer expenditure survey. And the consumer expenditure survey is the basis of the consumer price index. When you look at the consumer price index, it's based on a basket of goods. It's a Laspaire's price index. And the source of the data on the household consumption is what we're going to talk about next week, which is the consumer expenditure survey. And they go out and do very detailed analysis to collect information.
Are you going to send out the presentation?
Yes, I'll send it to Christine, and then she can send it out to whoever wants it, okay? Thanks so much for coming. We'll see you all next week.